Mental health in the medieval world. You might imagine the medieval world as filled with clashing swords, devout pilgrims, and chanting monks, and you wouldn't be wrong. But amid the cathedrals and castles, beneath the roaring sermons and peasants' gossip, lived another reality. One rarely recorded, and even more rarely understood. Mental illness. To begin, let us walk through the narrow lanes of 13th century London. Not far from the city wall, where stood a small priory known as St. Mary of Bethlehem. It was founded not as a hospital, and certainly not as a place of healing, but as a house of religious devotion. The monks there were not doctors, nor did they claim to be. Yet over time, this small religious house, eventually known by its infamous nickname Bedlam, would become England's most enduring symbol of madness. Before Bedlam became an asylum, the very idea of treating mental illness was virtually non-existent in Europe. The medieval understanding of the mind and its breakdown was inseparable from religious belief. Madness was not a medical condition. It was a punishment from God, a test of faith, or worse, evidence of demonic possession. In rare cases, it might be seen as a kind of divine insight, a madness granted by saints. But for most, it was simply terrifying. The medieval world had a taxonomy of spiritual afflictions. Melancholia, for instance, was considered both a spiritual failing and a bodily imbalance, rooted in the black bile of Galenic medicine. The four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile were the diagnostic tools of the day. Too much black bile. The patient might suffer sadness, sluggishness, or visions. Physicians might recommend bloodletting or dietary changes. But if one shouted nonsense in the marketplace, or tore their clothes in the street, the church might be called instead. Families dealt with madness privately, in shame or secrecy. A man who began to rave at night, who failed to work, who could not be trusted with animals or tools, might simply be locked in a shed. Others were sent to monasteries, where the care offered was less about healing and more about containment. The monks at Bethlehem, like their counterparts across Europe, believed that isolation, prayer, and discipline might calm a troubled soul. Silence was medicine. So was bread, water, and scripture. But not everyone saw the mad as needing care. In medieval towns, those deemed harmless were sometimes tolerated as fools or natural idiots. You might find one wandering the streets, clothed in rags, fed by scraps from the market. Some towns had village idiots, figures both mocked and pitied. Others were locked away. Occasionally, someone might be placed under guardianship, not to be helped, but to ensure they didn't waste the family's property. The church offered various categories for mental breakdowns. Frenzy described uncontrollable violence or hallucinations. Melancholy spoke to a pervasive sadness, possibly depression. Possession, of course, was treated with exorcism, fasting, and prayer. The diagnosis mattered little to the outcome. Treatments were spiritual, not medical. Still, by the 13th century, a subtle change was beginning. Some monasteries, those near larger towns, began to record their observations of these troubled individuals. In scattered priory records, we see the first hints of medieval mental health documentation. A monk might note, "Brother Thomas now speaks of voices in the rafters," or "Sister Agnes refuses to eat and sings to herself through the night." These entries are brief, often judgmental, and almost never compassionate by modern standards. But they exist, and within these notes, we begin to hear faint echoes of individual suffering. There is one entry from the Benedictine priory of St. Albans describing a lay brother who weeps in the orchard daily and strikes his head upon the trees. The monks confined him, prayed over him, and eventually placed him in a locked room. The final note says simply, "He no longer speaks." What stands out in these stories is not the cruelty, though some of it is cruel, but the complete absence of understanding. There was no concept of trauma, no knowledge of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or depression. Even the idea of a brain-based illness was centuries away. These people were broken, not sick, afflicted, not injured. The Church's growing interest in madness was partly spiritual, but also practical. In a tightly ordered society, unpredictable behavior threatened the moral and social order. A madman could disrupt services, defile holy ground, or frighten pilgrims. Worse still, his condition might be seen as contagious not medically, but morally. The sin of madness, some feared, could corrupt the weak, and so, gradually, institutions like Bedlam began to serve a dual role, refuge and prison. Those sent there were isolated from society, but also from kindness. Early records suggest patients were chained, confined to cells, and treated with harsh discipline. Bedlam was not yet a hospital. It was a holding place, cloaked in piety. Over time, Bedlam would expand, both physically and in reputation. But in these early centuries, it remained a small, somber place, a spiritual warehouse for the misunderstood. And yet, even here, we find evidence of resistance and survival. One patient, an anonymous woman labeled mad with grief, was permitted to tend the herb garden. She grew lavender and sage. Another, a young man who screamed through the night, was eventually calmed by long walks with a sympathetic friar. Such moments were rare, but they mattered in the medieval world. To be mad was to be feared, confined, or ignored. But in the margins of priory records, in the silent gardens of monasteries, and in the quiet routines of the afflicted, we find glimpses of something more. Not healing, perhaps, but endurance. How did society move from locking away the mad to trying to understand them? And what did the monks of Bedlam eventually learn or fail to learn about the minds they struggled to control? If the quiet cells of St. Mary of Bethlehem revealed the medieval world's fear of mental illness, then its treatments tell an even deeper story, a story not of understanding, but of tradition, superstition, and trial by belief. As the 14th and 15th centuries progressed, the idea of care for the mentally ill expanded. But care in the medieval sense did not necessarily imply comfort. Rather, it meant control, custody, and a religious response to perceived spiritual disarray. Madness was not healed. It was endured, punished, or mystified. In the towns outside the monastery walls, mental illness was treated with a haphazard combination of folk remedies, religious rites, and civic regulation. Families who could not manage an afflicted member often appealed to the local church or town magistrate. In some cases, those deemed violent or unpredictable were taken into custody not by physicians, but by constables or local officials. They were placed in prisons or cages, not hospitals. Even among the wealthy, treatment of mental illness remained primitive. In the royal courts, if a nobleman began to behave erratically, refusing food, weeping uncontrollably, or speaking incoherently, his family might blame witchcraft or a curse. They would summon not a doctor, but a priest or an astrologer. Charms might be sewn into his clothing. He might be forced to drink potions made of boiled herbs, or wear a blessed relic on a chain around his neck. The use of amulets, inscribed prayers, and sacred texts bound in leather was widespread, particularly for those believed to be afflicted by demons. Indeed, demonology played a dominant role in how society understood mental disturbances. From the 11th century onward, church writings increasingly connected madness to sin or possession. Augustine had once declared that only divine truth could restore order to a disordered soul, and his words echoed for centuries. The afflicted were not sick, they were spiritually compromised. This belief shaped not just treatment, but punishment. Public exorcisms became a spectacle. A priest might shout over a writhing patient, sprinkle him with holy water, and command the demon to depart. If the patient continued to convulse or resist, it was taken as proof of spiritual infestation. The rites could be long, and sometimes violent, yet not all was grim spectacle. In villages and smaller towns, care for the mentally ill often fell to the women of the household or local wise women figures, both respected and feared. These midwives of the mind offered herbal remedies, whispered prayers, and practical advice. Valerian root, henbane, and poppy were used to calm the agitated. Lavender was placed beneath pillows. Some even believed that walking a mad person in circles on sacred ground could restore balance. Medical theory, based on ancient Greek ideas, also found its way into treatment, though rarely with great success. The works of Hippocrates and Galen, translated and studied by Islamic scholars and later reintroduced into Europe, emphasized the four humors. Madness was an imbalance. Too much black bile might cause melancholia. An excess of yellow bile might lead to rage. Physicians, when consulted, recommended strict diets, enemas, and bloodletting. Some even applied leeches or cold compresses to the head. One common treatment was purging the body of bad humors. Patients were forced to vomit or bleed. Others were immersed in cold water to shock the senses. Sometimes they were deprived of sleep or placed on a regimen of fasting and prayer. These methods were brutal by today's standards, but they were not born of cruelty. They were rooted in desperation and ignorance. Still, amid the chaos and confusion, we find occasional efforts at compassion. Charitable institutions, especially in the later Middle Ages, began to take an interest in those deemed mad. A few hospitals, mostly in larger cities like Paris or Milan, opened wards for the insane. These wards were not curative in any modern sense, but they did provide shelter, food, and basic hygiene. In Paris, the Hôtel Dieu received mentally ill patients alongside the physically sick. Records from the 15th century mention quiet madmen being permitted to walk in enclosed gardens, while the violent ones were chained in cells. In England, Bedlam, by now better known to the public, became both a place of confinement and, oddly, a tourist attraction. By the 1400s, Londoners could pay to view the mad residents through barred windows or during public walks. This disturbing practice blurred the line between pity and mockery. Some visitors brought coins or bread. Others laughed or recoiled. Wealthier families sometimes kept afflicted relatives at home under lock and key. One 14th century landowner in Yorkshire built a small stone room adjacent to his manor house, where his brother, believed to be mad, lived for 20 years. The room had a tiny window and was stocked with bread, dried fish, and religious texts. He was allowed to walk the orchard only at dawn. The arrangement was legal and, perhaps, by the standards of the time, even humane. The church began to formalize its views as well. By the 15th century, canon law distinguished between the insane and the possessed. This shift, though slight, allowed for more nuanced responses. A madman might be placed under guardianship rather than excommunicated. He might be prayed for, not punished. Some saints became associated with mental illness. Saint Dymphna, an Irish martyr, was believed to protect the mentally disturbed. Her shrine in Geel, in modern-day Belgium, became a pilgrimage site. What set Geel apart, however, was not the shrine, but the care model that developed there. Families in the town took in pilgrims suffering from madness, housing them, feeding them, and including them in daily life. This practice, known as the family care system, endured for centuries. It represented a rare early form of community mental health support. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, a different vision of mental health had taken root. In cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo, physicians drew upon Greco-Roman texts, translated into Arabic, and enriched with their own insights. Hospitals called Bimaristan Zofen included wards for those with mental disturbances. Treatment involved music therapy, bathing, conversation, and herbal medicine. Patients were not always cured, but they were treated with dignity. Some of this knowledge filtered back into Europe during the Crusades and through Spain, where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars shared texts and ideas. But the European response remained slower, more cautious, and heavily spiritualized. Still, by the late Middle Ages, a quiet shift had begun. Physicians were starting to keep notes. Monks recorded symptoms. Families spoke in terms of illness, not just sin. The language of madness was evolving. The mentally ill were still feared and misunderstood, but they were also being observed, named, and categorized. The road ahead was long. Bedlam remained a prison as much as a refuge. Most of Europe still locked the mad away, but a seed had been planted, one that would, centuries later, grow into the modern field of psychiatry. And yet, one must ask, what did those suffering souls think of their world? Of the chains, the herbs, the prayers shouted in their faces? Did they know they were different, or did they simply suffer in silence, waiting for something no one could name? By the dawn of the 16th century, mental illness in Europe was no longer just the province of monasteries and mystical rites. Though understanding remained limited and compassion inconsistent, a long and uneven shift had begun, a slow emergence from centuries of silence into something resembling recognition. The world had changed. The Black Death had swept across Europe, reshaping population, economics, and belief systems. Cities had grown. Universities like those in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford had become centers not just of theology but of medicine and philosophy. With the gradual rediscovery and translation of ancient Greek and Roman texts, European thinkers began to reconsider the nature of the body, the mind, and human behavior. Still, the mentally ill remained largely at the margins. But in those margins, records grew more detailed. In civic registries, court documents, and medical treatises, we begin to hear more about these individuals, not just as burdens or curiosities, but as people with lives, names, and stories. Take, for example, the case of John Hall, a London tailor in the mid-1400s, described in court rolls as distraught in wit. John reportedly wandered from shop to shop, repeating fragments of prayers and nursery rhymes. His behavior frightened customers. Eventually, the city placed him under watch, a kind of monitored guardianship. He was not imprisoned, but his movements were limited. His neighbors fed him, and one fellow tailor reportedly allowed him to sleep in his shop after hours. For all its limitations, this was a form of community care, and informal, but real. In other cities, more structured responses developed. The city of Valencia in Spain created ordinances in the late 1400s to provide care for the infirm of mind. These provisions included food, clothing, and even basic medical attention. In Italy, cities like Florence and Siena began to maintain public institutions for the poor and mentally ill, places of crude confinement. Yes, but also of official responsibility. The growth of these institutions coincided with a new breed of medical thinker, the physician scholar, educated in Latin, trained in anatomy, and schooled in classical logic. These men, almost always men, began to look at madness as something to be studied, perhaps even treated. The 15th century French physician Jacques Ferrand wrote extensively on melancholia, describing symptoms that resemble modern depression. He spoke of deep sadness, loss of appetite, sleep disturbances, and even suicidal thoughts, not as signs of demonic influence, but as medical issues. And yet, for all this new thought, the lived reality of the mentally ill remained difficult. Bedlam, by now infamous, continued to function as both a charitable asylum and a social spectacle. Patients were still chained, sometimes beaten, and often put on public display. Conditions were harsh. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and rudimentary food were the norm. The institution served more to hide the afflicted than to help them. But something else was happening. Our idea was taking root, that madness, while frightening, was also human, and that it might be understood. Literature began to reflect this change. In Shakespeare's plays, written at the turn of the 17th century, madness appears again and again, not just as a punishment or a joke, but as a state of mind with meaning. Ophelia's grief-driven unraveling in Hamlet, King Lear's wandering, despair, and even the fool's cryptic wisdom suggest a dawning awareness that mental distress is part of the human condition. Back in the real world, however, the institutional model expanded. As cities grew, so did the need to manage those who did not fit the mold. Madness, like poverty, was increasingly bureaucratized. In France, the Hôpital Général of Paris was established in 1656, bringing together the sick, the poor, and the insane under one roof. Across Europe, similar institutions sprang up, often blending charity with control. These asylums were often bleak, but they also represented, in their own way, a step forward. For the first time, society acknowledged mental illness not as a divine curse, but as a condition requiring social and medical response. The methods were flawed, the understanding was partial, but the door had opened. The voices of the mad themselves, however, remain elusive. They rarely wrote. Their stories were told by others, by clerks, by priests, by family members, but every so often, one emerges. In 1497, a woman named Marjorie Kemp dictated her life story to a scribe. In it, she described hearing voices, seeing visions, and experiencing profound emotional upheaval. For years, she was dismissed by many as hysterical or heretical, but her book, The Book of Marjorie Kemp, is now recognized as one of the earliest English-language autobiographies, on one of the few from the medieval period, to describe what may be a form of mental illness in the first person. Marjorie's visions were interpreted as holy. Others in her time were not so fortunate, but her words endure, offering a rare window into a troubled, ecstatic mind in an age of silence. As we step back from this long and often painful journey through medieval mental health, a few patterns become clear. The Middle Ages did not have a coherent concept of mental illness, but they did have many responses to it: spiritual, social, medical, and familial. These responses were inconsistent, sometimes cruel, sometimes compassionate, but they were responses. They were the first stumblings of a society beginning to confront the most complex organ of all, the human mind. Today, our understanding is far from perfect. Mental illness still carries stigma, treatment is still uneven, and the line between care and control remains blurred in many places. But we have names now: depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. We have medicines, therapies, and, crucially, a growing sense that mental suffering deserves empathy, not fear. And so, we return to that quiet cell in St. Mary of Bethlehem, where a monk once sat outside a door, listening to a man inside shout verses from the Psalms. The monk, unsure of what to do, prayed. He did not understand the man's affliction. He had no tools, but he stayed. Perhaps that was the beginning not of cure, but of care. The secret lives of historical nobility have likely seen portraits of nobility figures standing stiffly in grand rooms, draped in heavy brocade, a hand resting on a globe or a sword, the face expressionless, surrounded by symbols of power. These images endure in the modern mind, wealthy, well-fed, and well-dressed, their lives seemingly effortless. But behind those still faces and embroidered curtains lived people, whose lives were governed not by ease but by endless routine, bureaucracy, discomfort, and constant surveillance. In fact, to be a noble in the pre-modern world, especially from the late medieval period through the 18th century, was to live under constant pressure. Nobility meant more than privilege. It meant performance, and the performance never stopped. Let us walk, quietly now, into a 17th century noble household in France. It is just after sunrise, and already the household is stirring. In a room far larger than necessary, cold despite the ornate fireplace, the nobleman is being awakened not by sunlight, but by servants. His lever, or rising ceremony, is a small daily event involving multiple people. A valet brings warm water, another draws the curtains, someone else places the appropriate wig and robe nearby. The man being dressed, stripped, and reassembled, like a living mannequin, is not a king. He is a mid-ranking noble, one of hundreds who mimicked the courtly rituals of Versailles, whose day is planned down to the minute, though most of it will be spent sitting, walking, eating, or waiting. He will write letters, always formal, always filtered through layers of etiquette. He will receive guests. He will dine always under observation, always with a hierarchy of seating and serving. He cannot scratch his head in public without it being seen as a signal of boredom. He cannot laugh too loudly, nor may he weep in front of others, unless performing grief at a funeral. Much of his energy is spent maintaining status, not enjoying it. His wife's life is no less regimented. A noblewoman in this period is not idle, though the world will often treat her as decorative. She manages an entire domestic economy overseas: cooks, laundresses, nurses, wet nurses, needlewomen, footmen, and tutors. She must be polite to everyone, but familiar with no one. Her correspondence is strategic, her wardrobe calculated to project wealth without appearing too garish. For both husband and wife, the private life is largely an illusion. Nobles rarely had true privacy. Their bedrooms were visited regularly by servants, letters might be read by others. Even their bodily needs, bathing, dressing, using the chamber pot, were sometimes public rituals. Privacy, in the modern sense, simply did not exist. The structure of noble households varied across Europe, but the pattern was the same. The noble lived at the center of a bustling administrative machine. In England, a great estate like Hatfield or Chatsworth required stewards, clerks, land agents, and gamekeepers. These were not personal staff, they were corporate, managerial. The noble might know some of their names. He likely did not know all their faces. His role was to appear, to judge, to approve, and to be seen doing so. The day might begin with petitions. Tenants arrived to report broken fences or ask for lower rents. A steward might present a ledger for inspection. If the noble was engaged in court affairs, his morning might be taken up with preparing for a journey to London or Versailles. This meant packing an entire miniature version of the household servants: bedding, food, writing supplies, even chambered pots. Nobles did not travel light. Meals were social tests. The food served was symbolic: venison for wealth, exotic spices for sophistication, white bread for refinement. The act of dining was as much about being seen as about eating. In some places, nobles dined in front of spectators. In others, even small infractions, elbows on the table. Speaking out of turn could trigger gossip that reached the court. The court itself was the central theater of noble anxiety. At Versailles, the system designed by Louis XIV turned nobility into a full-time occupation. Those admitted to court had to maintain elaborate wardrobes, pay bribes to secure invitations, and endure endless hours standing in the hall of mirrors or waiting to be noticed during a promenade. Failure to appear regularly could mean losing royal favor and, with it, pensions, titles, or legal privileges. It was, in essence, a game with no days off. The clothes were heavy, the wigs were itchy, the shoes fashionable but narrow often caused chronic pain. Corsets deformed rib cages. Cosmetics, made with lead and mercury, slowly poisoned the skin. To be noble was to wear one's status, literally, at the cost of one's comfort and health. Yet it was not all performance. Beneath the etiquette, nobles had real responsibilities. They were expected to manage land, resolve disputes, and sponsor religious or civic projects. A nobleman might serve as a magistrate or military officer. A noblewoman might sponsor a parish school or oversee dowries for her maids. And then there were the letters, always the letters. Nobles wrote constantly, without phones or easy travel. Correspondence was the primary tool of power, gossip, and persuasion. A well-timed letter could secure a marriage alliance, settle a debt, or destroy a rival. Noble households employed secretaries whose entire job was to draft, translate, and dispatch letters on behalf of their lords. These letters survive in dusty archives. They reveal a world that was anxious, bureaucratic, and strangely familiar. Noblemen fretted about taxes. Noblewomen complained about poor servants or high fabric prices. Children died young. Crops failed. Even great families could slide into ruin if they spent too much on clothing or mistimed their political allegiances. And yet, they rarely wrote about happiness. The emotional language of noble life was constrained. Love was hinted at, not declared. Grief was formulaic. Joy was muted. The emotional temperature of noble correspondence is often cool, not because these people lacked feelings, but because they had no safe way to express them. Reputation was everything. Vulnerability was dangerous. Nobility was also inherited, not equally. Younger sons often lived in limbo. They had titles, but no land. Some entered the church, others joined the military. Still others drifted, depending on allowances from elder brothers and facing constant whispers of inadequacy. Daughters, too, were ranked by marriage prospects. The second or third daughter might be sent to a convent not from devotion, but because dowries were too expensive. At home, noble children were raised by tutors and governesses, often at a distance from their parents. Fathers saw their sons mainly for instruction. Mothers visited daughters during embroidery sessions. Emotional closeness was not prioritized. It was a luxury, one often sacrificed for appearances. In this world of strict order and relentless formality, even illness became performance. A noble's deathbed was rarely private. Family, clergy, and courtiers might attend, watching as the dying man or woman confessed sins, gave final instructions, and composed their face for death. The funeral would follow strict etiquette, from the number of torchbearers to the arrangement of mourning clothes. To be noble was to die in public, just as one had lived, and yet behind the performance, something more human endured. Amid the ledgers and linens, the frostbitten walks and candlelit suppers, small rebellions occurred. A noblewoman might sneak a book of poetry into her prayer book. A tired lord might feign illness to avoid court. A footman might be paid to deliver a love note instead of an official letter. These moments don't appear in grand portraits, but they shape the days behind the velvet curtains. As we pause here, one must wonder, did these nobles ever tire of the act? Did they yearn for freedom from formality, or had the performance become their only reality? If the image of nobility gleams with gold and ceremony, the reality behind it was often something quite different, ongoing, exhausting struggle to stay noble. The titles were inherited, yes, but the trappings of nobility, silks, servants, feasts, carriages, land, and political influence acquired a constant, often overwhelming stream of money. And money, as it turns out, was one thing many nobles did not have enough of. Let's begin with a ledger on unassuming object, but one that tells the true story of noble life. In a worn leather-bound volume from the estate of a minor German count in the late 17th century, we find pages and pages of numbers: wine purchases, servant wages, saddle repairs, dowry loans, and candle orders. But between the entries, something else creeps in. There are debts owed to tailors, spice merchants, apothecaries, goldsmiths. There are delays in payments, There are notes of land rents going uncollected. And then, there are the desperate strategies: mortgaging parcels of land, arranging interest loans with local bankers, and pressuring tenants to pay early. You see, nobility came with fixed income rents from peasants, stipends from the king, or yields from fields, but expenses were variable, and usually rising. A nobleman could not simply live modestly. He was expected to appear noble at all times. That meant maintaining carriages and a proper stable, throwing elaborate dinners, and hosting seasonal guests. It meant sending children to the right tutors and providing appropriate dowries for daughters. A wedding, done improperly, could ruin a reputation. A funeral too modest could suggest disgrace, so nobles borrowed, and borrowed again. French nobles in the 18th century were so dependent on credit that entire generations lived in quiet, managed bankruptcy. In England, the same was true, especially for the landed gentry. Despite vast estates, many lived under enormous pressure. A noble household might be full of portraits and silver, but lacking in liquid cash. The sale of one's plate, or worse, land, was seen as a last resort, and often hidden behind legal language. Debt was so common that it became part of noble life. There were accepted courtesy tailors and grocers, extended long lines of credit. Legal actions were rare, since suing a noble client could mean losing all future business. Bankers learned to manage these debts quietly, hoping for a generous inheritance or a politically useful marriage to bring the account back into balance. The financial strain had other consequences. Many nobles married for money. It was not unusual for an ancient but poor noble family to arrange a union with a wealthy but common merchant family. This was especially common in cities like Venice and Florence, where merchants craved titles and nobles needed coin. The result was a kind of social alchemy: nobility diluted by necessity. Women were often at the center of this economic exchange. A noble daughter was a financial asset, and her marriage was a negotiation. Her dowry could rescue the family estate. Her husband might be chosen not for charm, but for the number of carriages he could bring to the ceremony. And once married, her job was to maintain appearances and produce heirs, both of which required spending. The financial burdens even followed nobles to death. Funerals were expected to be grand. In Poland, 17th century noble funerals might include a week of feasting, with entire villages invited. Coffins were gilded. Priests were paid to sing mass for the deceased's soul, often for months. The cost could cripple a family. And yet, to bury a noble poorly was to suggest dishonor. The domestic burdens were no lighter. Though surrounded by servants, noble families faced constant logistical headaches. Food had to be ordered daily. Laundry was endless. Heating massive stone homes in the winter required entire teams of workers just to carry firewood. Chimneys needed clearing. Walls needed replastering. Roofs leaked. Few noble homes were truly comfortable. Many were drafty, damp, and dark. Glass windows were expensive and fragile. Tapestries helped insulate rooms, but they also trapped smells of smoke, sweat, and cooked meat. Chamber pots, emptied regularly by footmen, could still overflow. Bathing was rare. Mice and fleas were not. These homes were estates, yes, but also factories, farms, legal offices, and small governments rolled into one. The noble family was the executive, but they were rarely in control. Take the Countess of Harcourt, who in 1741 wrote in her household journal, "The linen was returned, stained. The steward again refused to dismiss the offending girl, and now the cook, too, has left without notice." Her words are not dramatic. They are weary. The life of a noblewoman was often consumed by domestic disputes among servants, with suppliers, or even within her own family. Nobility offered influence, not peace. There were, of course, periods of leisure. Nobles hunted, rode horses, played cards, and attended salons. But even these diversions were competitive. Who had the most fashionable hounds? Who wore the newest silk from Lion? Who could recite Latin poetry at dinner? Leisure was another arena of performance. And then there were the children. Noble children were raised to continue the performance. Boys were taught fencing, Latin, and etiquette: how to bow, when to laugh, how to flatter a superior without appearing servile. Girls learnt music, embroidery, languages, and how to manage a household. Education was rigid. Emotion was secondary. Those who failed to meet expectations, children with disabilities, those who rebelled, or who showed signs of melancholy, were often hidden or sent away. In some cases, such as with younger sons or daughters deemed unsuitable, this meant convents or in others, it meant quiet exile on a cousin's estate. And always, behind all of this, was the unspoken fear of decline. Nobility was not a guarantee of permanence. Titles could fall into disuse, lands could be lost, influence could shift with the monarch or the church. A single generation of mismanagement or a political scandal could doom a family line. We find evidence of this in dusty court records. A once prominent nobleman, now forced to petition for a pension. A baroness writing to her brother in despair because their house was falling into disrepair. A young count forced into a political marriage to save his estate. Behind the titles and ceremony were fragile threads that frayed easily. And still, every day, the performance resumed. The letters were written, the wigs powdered, the silver polished. The noble life continued, not effortless, but laborious. And so we ask, if the noble classes lived under such constant strain, both financial and personal, why cling to the system at all? Why did they not walk away, simplify, start anew? Was it pride, tradition, or was the performance all they had left? By the time the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the world that had sustained the nobility for centuries began to change, not in sudden revolutions alone, but through 1,000 quiet shifts, economic, political, cultural. In these final centuries of aristocratic life, noble households found themselves not only preserving tradition, but defending it against erosion. Their titles still held weight, but the world no longer revolved around them. For some, this change came abruptly. In France, the Revolution of 1789 did more than topple the monarchy. It dismantled the entire architecture of noble privilege. Titles were outlawed, estates were confiscated. Hundreds of noble families fled, seeking refuge in England, Austria, or Russia. Others tried to remain, stripping coats of arms from gates, dressing plainly, and burning documents that traced their lineage. In the years that followed, even those who survived physically often vanished culturally. A noble who had once presided over a salon in Paris now rented a small flat in London, living off jewelry pawned quietly on a side street. A duchess who once had dozens of servants now folded her own linens. For these exiles, the rituals of nobility became private memories rehearsed, not in public ceremonies, but in modest drawing rooms, over watered-down tea. Elsewhere in Europe, the decline was slower, but no less inevitable. In Britain, the aristocracy retained formal power. Well into the 19th century, they dominated parliament, commanded regiments, and owned vast swaths of land. But the Industrial Revolution brought new wealth, raw, fast, unapologetic. Factory owners and financiers soon outpaced country lords. The new money was not always polished, but it was powerful, and it could buy almost everything, even influence. In response, many noble families sought to adapt. They leased their estates to industrialists. They married into merchant families. They opened their country houses to tourists and charged admission. A few entered politics directly, shedding powdered wigs for business suits. But for every successful adaptation, there were failures. Titles became ornamental. Manners were abandoned. Family portraits molded in attics as roofs caved in. And yet, in these last chapters of noble life, we find some of the most human stories. Take the case of Count Gustav von Arnim, a minor Prussian noble in the mid-19th century. His estate, once thriving, had fallen into debt. Instead of defaulting quietly, he began giving music lessons in Berlin, using his title as a marketing gimmick. He became known as the Count Pianist. He paid his debts slowly and never married, fearing he could not support a wife. His students remembered him as gentle, melancholy, and always over-ostracized. In Tuscany, an aging noblewoman named Clara di Montevacchi kept a diary that spans 40 years. In it, she records the sale of the family's last vineyard, the death of the household cook, and her decision to take in boarders, wealthy English tourists who came for the sun. Her tone is resigned, but proud. She writes of hosting tea for them in the drawing room, using chipped porcelain that once belonged to her grandmother. "I do not mind that they do not know who I am," she notes in one entry. "Sometimes, I am not sure myself." These are not dramatic stories. They are quiet, persistent. A family stops ordering new clothes. A servant is let go. The family chapel becomes a storage room. The garden goes untended. The velvet curtains, once drawn back every morning by footmen, are now stiff with dust. hanging undisturbed, and yet, even in this slow decline, the rituals remained. Letters continued to be written, now shorter, with simpler paper and cheaper ink. Etiquette was observed, even if only among siblings or in the presence of a single servant. Titles were used within the family, whispered like incantations. What, then, remained of nobility when wealth, land, and influence were lost? The answer, for many, was memory. Genealogies were still copied out by hand, even when estates were sold. Portraits were rescued from fires. Trunks of lace and documents were stored in boarding houses. Grandmothers told children stories of balls and coronations, of days when their family name opened doors. Some became historians of their own decline. In Austria-Hungary, Baron Franz von Ritter published a slim memoir in 1903 titled Notes from a Forgotten Parlor. It is not a boastful book. It details his youth in a manor with 40 rooms, and his old age in a Vienna apartment with a view of the coal yard. He does not complain. It is a relief, he writes, to hang one's own curtains, and to know when they will be drawn. This was the final transformation of nobility, not as rulers or symbols, but as relics. People who once dominated court life were now private individuals, surviving with dignity, carrying their manners into modest rooms. They became librarians, teachers, archivists. Their last act of nobility was not conquest but endurance. There is a certain melancholy, beauty in this. Stripped of power, nobles became ordinary, and in becoming ordinary, their lives became more visible, more relatable. A letter about an unpaid tailor becomes no different from any modern bill. A journal entry about loneliness echoes through centuries. The noble house, once a fortress of ritual, becomes a home like any other, filled with grief, hope, and dust. We tend to think of history in turning points, revolutions, wars, edicts, but often, change happens more like this, quietly, painfully, in worn upholstery and unpaid debts, in unused gardens and unopened doors. So the next time you see a noble portrait gilded frame, distant gaze pause for a moment. Behind the velvet, beyond the ceremony, was a human life, perhaps not so different from your own. And as their carriages faded from the streets, their power dissolved into paper. One must wonder, what is status without certainty? And when the performance ends, what remains of the performer? Life and mystery at the Palace of Nassau. The Palace of Nassau stands today as a tangle of sun-bleached stones and half-reconstructed pillars, perched just south of modern Heraklion. Tourists come to see the faded frescoes, to imagine the Minotaur, or to marvel at the red columns with their flared tops. But this palace was no stage for myth. It was an engine of administration, possibly the most complex and quietly bureaucratic structure of the Bronze Age Aegean. It is easy to forget that. Once, Narcissus was not a ruin but a humming civic center, not a palace of kings, but a compound of scribes, potters, weavers, priests, and stewards. And so, to understand it, we must forget the Minotaur and Ariadne, and instead imagine the rhythm of an ordinary day. Around 1500 BCE, in the heart of Crete, the day begins before sunrise. The air is already warm, and the sea breeze carries the scent of olive and damp earth. From the upper levels of the palace, a young man, perhaps an apprentice scribe, descends carefully down a wide staircase. The stone beneath his feet has been worn smooth. Torch brackets line the walls, though they are now unlit. He carries with him a soft bundle of prepared clay tablets and a damp cloth to keep them from drying too quickly. His work, like that of many others in the palace, is not glamorous. He will spend the morning recording shipments, oil from the southern hills, wool from mountain villages, grain delivered from outlying storehouses. He uses a stylus of wood or bone to impress small linear symbols into the clay. The script is called linear an undeciphered form of writing used by the Minoans. We know what it looks like, but not exactly what it says. It is quiet work. It is important work. Across the complex, others are stirring. In the central courtyard, an open space larger than a modern city square, workers sweep dust from the paving stones. A priestess in linen robes walks silently toward a small shrine. In a nearby room, a servant stokes the coals beneath a copper cauldron. The aroma of spiced wine and barley porridge begins to fill the corridor. This is a place of movement, but not of chaos. The palace is a maze, yes, but it is designed with purpose. Over 1,000 interlocking rooms, some large and open, others tight and dark, connect through narrow passageways, staircases, and light wells. It is not a defensive fortress. There are no thick walls or moats. It was not meant to be hidden or protected. It was meant to be accessed, navigated, used. Much of the palace's function revolves around storage. Beneath the central complex are long, narrow magazines, rows upon rows of rooms filled with pithoi, massive ceramic jars taller than a man. These containers store oil, wine, grain, and possibly even honey. They are marked, sometimes stamped, and carefully sealed. The logistics of inventory, distribution, and tribute are handled with a system so sophisticated that even modern archaeologists marvel at its precision. And this is what often surprises people. We tend to imagine the past as disorganized or crude, but Narcissus was nothing of the sort. Its society functioned on routine. It required order. The palace was a government, a temple, a warehouse, a treasury, and a courtal in one sprawling building. The architecture reflects this. Light wells bring air and illumination into inner chambers. A complex system of terracotta pipes channels wastewater away from kitchens and bath areas. There are multiple floors, constructed with such skill that staircases remain intact even today. Walls were painted not just for beauty, but for identity, marking certain rooms as ceremonial, others as residential, others as administrative. Let us pause. Now in one such room, it is small. The ceiling is low. Light filters in from a slit. Near the ceiling, on a wide bench, 5 clay tablets are laid out to dry. They are incised with rows of small symbols. These are not love letters or poems. They are records. A list of quantities: 30 jars of oil, 15 rolls of wool, 12 amphorae of wine. A contribution from a village to the north. Nearby, a figure in a dyed tunic pores over another set of tablets, comparing symbols, murmuring softly. He adjusts a mark with the tip of his stylus. Behind him is a wooden shelf, simple, practical. It holds a ledger of the sort we would recognize today, if we could only read the writing. It is bureaucracy, not in the dull, modern sense, but in the ancient one, the craft of remembering things in order. That is what Narcissus excelled at: remembering, cataloging, distributing. The palace existed not to dazzle foreign visitors or house a grand king, but to manage the affairs of a maritime economy. Crete traded with Egypt, the Levant, and mainland Greece. Its ports shipped textiles, saffron, pottery, and timber. Its wealth did not come from conquest, but from administration. Yet there were ceremonies. On certain days, the courtyard filled with dancers and musicians. Horns blew, drums beat. Some believed that acrobats performed feats of bull over the backs of charging bulls in ritual games. These may have taken place here, in the very center of the complex, but they were not entertainment alone. They were civic rituals, displays of power, balance, and grace. The Minoans left behind images of them in frescoes, young, agile bodies, flying over horns, framed by elegant columns. Elsewhere in the palace, frescoes depict nature: blue monkeys, dolphins, lilies, and birds. These are not violent images. There are no war scenes, no battles. Even the mythical creatures that appear, griffins, for instance, seem more decorative than menacing. It is as if the society projected peace and prosperity as its defining image, and perhaps it was. Or perhaps the violence was simply done elsewhere. There is a curious absence of weaponry in Minoan sites. Few fortifications, few swords. Some scholars believe this suggests a society that valued trade and diplomacy over warfare. Others argue that the power of Narcissus was so dominant that it didn't need to defend itself. Tribute flowed in, goods flowed out, yet nothing lasts forever. Earthquakes periodically struck the region. Some of the rebuilding is visible even now. Corridors blocked, rooms patched with newer stone. And then, around 1450 BCE, something changed. The palace was damaged again, but this time it was not repaired with the same care. The style of pottery shifts. The writing changes from linear A to linear B. A script we can read. It is Greek, not Minoan. The Mycenaeans from mainland Greece had arrived. They did not raise they used it, they occupied it, added their own records, their own rituals. But the heart of the Minoan world was gone. The quiet bureaucracy, the painted dolphins, the bull-leaping games, they flickered out, recorded only in clay and memory. Even the myths that followed the labyrinth, the Minotaur, Daedalus and Icarus are echoes, distortions, interpretations of something older and more ordinary. A palace, a record-keeping center. a carefully run engine of a thriving island civilization. And so we must ask, how much of history is simply paperwork misremembered? To walk the ruins of Nasus today is to experience a silence that was never meant to be. The walls were once brightly painted. The rooms hummed with work and ritual. Fires crackled. Water gurgled through ceramic pipes. Sandals slapped against stone, and styluses scratched clay. Now, that sound is gone. What remains are fragments, architectural, archaeological, and cultural. Fragments that must be interpreted with care. The British archaeologist Arthur Evans arrived in Crete at the turn of the 20th century, determined to uncover the roots of Greek civilization. What he found at Nasus would reshape our understanding of the ancient Aegean and complicate it in ways that still echo today. Evans named the civilization Minoan, after the mythical king Minos. There is no evidence that the Minoans themselves used this term. Their real name is lost. We call them Minoans for convenience, a modern invention tied to myth, not fact. And yet, in those myths lies a distorted reflection of reality. Take the labyrinth. In the myth, it was a maze designed to imprison the Minotaur, a monstrous half-man, half-bull, but there is no physical labyrinth beneath Nasus. The palace itself, however, is vast, interconnected, and disorienting. The repetition of rooms, the twisting corridors, the absence of straight lines, it feels, even today, like a place designed to confuse. It is possible that visiting outsiders, perhaps Mycenaeans, saw Nasus and mistook its complexity for imprisonment. What was administrative order to the Minoans may have seemed monstrous to others, and what of the bull? Bulls feature prominently in Minoan art. They are painted in profile, charging or leaping. Their horns were venerated in symbolic sculptures called horns of consecration, abstract, crescent-like structures placed on rooftops and altars. To the Minoans, the bull was likely a sacred animal, associated with fertility, strength, or ritual. But there is no evidence of human sacrifice to a bull-headed god. No minotaur, no prison. Instead, there is the fresco of a youth flipping over the back of a bull, arms outstretched in flight. The myth, it seems, is a misunderstanding, memory filtered through fear and fascination. Yet the actual rituals of Nasus remain obscure. We know there were shrines, some with altars, others with triple axis labyrinths carved into the walls. We know that some rooms were designed to let in light from above, suggesting ritual significance, but the details elude us. No sacred texts survive, no Minoan hymns, no named deities. This absence is striking. Most Bronze Age civilizations left behind religious texts. The Egyptians carved prayers into tombs. The Hittites wrote rituals on clay. The Mesopotamians sang hymns to Ishtar and Enlil. But the Minoans left only images, women with raised arms, snakes twining around wrists, processions of figures carrying offerings. It is as if their spirituality was meant to be seen, not spoken. And so we interpret. The so-called snake goddess, figurines found in a small storeroom at Nasus have been analyzed endlessly. Made of faience, their bodices are open, their skirts flounced, their eyes wide. Snakes wrap around their arms. Some see them as priestesses, others as goddesses, still others as symbols of household protection. We cannot say for certain. The silence of their expressions remains unbroken. Much of what we know about Minoan life comes not from palaces, but from the remnants of the everyday. In the remains of kitchens, we find grinding stones, clay ovens, and fish bones. In workshops, we find loom weights, dye stains, and tiny pieces of gold foil. These are not the tools of royalty. They are the traces of workers, craftspeople, cooks, weavers. The Palace of Nasus was not simply a royal residence, it was a center of production. Textile manufacture was a major activity. Rooms lined with storage vessels and weaving tools suggest that Minoan Crete was a major exporter of Hiquati cloth. The wool was likely shorn from sheep kept on the upland pastures, then brought to workshops near the palace. Dyes were made from plants and mollusks. The colors were vivid reeds from madder, blues from woad, purples from the murex snail. And yet, the weavers' names are lost. The scribes are nameless too. The linear tablets do not sign their work. They are formulaic, economic, impersonal. The hands that carved them, the minds that tracked the numbers, they are gone. What remains is data without biography, a civilization deeply concerned with accounting, and strangely silent about its storytellers. It is tempting to project harmony onto the Minoans. They left behind no great war memorials, no fortresses, few weapons. Their art celebrates nature, birds, fish, trees. Their architecture is open, flowing. Their records are administrative, not imperial. But absence is not proof of peace. The Minoans were powerful. They controlled trade routes across the Aegean. Their pottery has been found in Cyprus, Egypt, and the Levant. They exerted influence over smaller islands. They may have collected tribute. They had the ability to build massive storage facilities, coordinate labor, and maintain a sprawling bureaucracy over generations. All of this suggests hierarchy. Someone was in charge. Someone benefited more than others. The priests, perhaps, or the palace elites. But unlike in Egypt or Mesopotamia, we have no names, no statues with carved dedications. Even the so-called throne room at Knossos is mysterious. It contains a stone seat, but no inscriptions, no clear context. Was it used for political gatherings, religious rites? Was the throne even for a person, or for a deity? The further we explore, the more questions arise. Why did the Minoans never adopt a more phonetic writing system? Why did they not carve inscriptions in stone? Why did they allow their language and their identity to vanish without resistance when the Mycenaeans took over? Did they, perhaps, see time differently? Their society seems cyclical, not linear. The art is full of spirals, coils, flowing lines. Rooms open onto courtyards which feed back into rooms. Light wells reflect the movement of the sun. Rituals seem seasonal, agricultural. Perhaps permanence was not their goal. Perhaps the Minoans believed that all things would pass and return. The silence of their record is not an accident. It may be a philosophy. And so, we are left with fragments, shards of pottery, tablets filled with unreadable marks, walls that once sang with color, and under it all, the unspoken question, can we ever truly know a civilization that chose not to tell us its story? By the middle of the 15th century BCE, the Palace of Knossos, once the humming center of Minoan civilization, had entered its final chapters. The once bustling corridors no longer echoed with the sounds of scribes and servants. The streets began to empty. The frescoes, flaking now, looked out over spaces where no ceremonies were held. It was not a fall with fire and shouting, but a slow retreat and unraveling, as quiet as the civilization itself had once been orderly. And yet, something did happen. Something large. Many scholars point to the cataclysmic eruption of the volcano at modern-day Santorini, which occurred sometime around 1600 to 1500 BCE. As a turning point in Minoan history, the explosion was one of the most powerful in human history, 4 times more energetic than Krakatoa, hurling ash and pumice high into the atmosphere, creating a tsunami that swept across the Aegean Sea. Though Crete was not destroyed directly by the eruption, it may have suffered in other, subtler ways. Tsunamis could have devastated coastal settlements. Ash may have affected agriculture. The skies would have darkened. Crops could have failed. Trade networks could have frayed. And into this moment of weakness stepped the Mycenaeans from the mainland. The evidence is delicate but compelling. At Knossos, around 1450 BCE, a transformation occurred. The language on the tablets shifts from the Minoan Linear A to the Mycenaean Linear B. This was not merely a new script. It was a new language, a new system of administration, a new elite. The palace, it seems, continued to function but under different management. The Mycenaeans took the framework of Minoan administration and repurposed it for their own uses. The bureaucracy endured, but the soul had changed. Where Minoan art once celebrated nature and fluidity, Mycenaean culture was more martial, more hierarchical. Linear B tablets mention chariots, armor, and weapons in a way that Minoan records never did. The architecture shifted to more emphasis on defense, more austere decoration. Still, Knossos functioned for a time. The administrative center continued to produce tablets and manage goods. The old storerooms were used, but it was, in many ways, a palace without a people. The broader Minoan culture, its rituals, its language, its worldview, was no longer in control. A great house was now a foreign office. And then, around 1375 BCE, even that ended. A fire consumed parts of the palace. Many of the Linear B tablets were preserved only because they were accidentally baked in the flames. The roof timbers collapsed. Walls buckled. The site was abandoned. Knossos, once the nexus of a seaborne civilization, was now a shell. No one rebuilt it. Why? Perhaps the center of power had shifted definitively to the mainland. Perhaps the cost of rebuilding was too great. Or perhaps Nasus had simply lost its relevance. The networks it once managed were gone. The traditions it once guarded were forgotten. What remained were ruins. Centuries passed. The Bronze Age waned. The Mycenaeans themselves collapsed. Their palaces burned and deserted around 1200 BCE, victims of yet another wave of mysterious upheaval across the Mediterranean. What followed in Greece was a long period of cultural amnesia, the so-called Greek Dark Ages. Writing disappeared. Monumental architecture vanished. Even the memory of Nasus faded. It was not until much later, hundreds of years later, that the myths began to form. Stories were told of a mighty king named Minos, who ruled from a labyrinth, of a beast, half man and half bull, who devoured the young, of a clever inventor, Daedalus, who built impossible machines and flew on wings of wax, of a daughter, Ariadne, who betrayed her father to help her lover escape. These stories are fiction, but not without foundation. They are echoes, distorted through time. The labyrinth is a memory of Knossos, the bull, a symbol from frescoes and ritual. Minos himself, perhaps a dim reflection of palace authority. The myths are not accurate, but they are not meaningless. They are how later people made sense of ruins they did not understand. When Arthur Evans excavated Nasus in the early 1900s, he interpreted much through the lens of myth. He restored columns and frescoes, sometimes creatively. He built parts of the site with concrete an approach criticized today. But he also understood something vital, that Knossos was a center of power, ritual, and administration unlike anything. In the ancient world, his reconstruction was imperfect. His interpretations were often speculative, and yet, thanks to his work, the ruins were preserved and the Minoans reintroduced to the world, but they remain elusive. Linear, the original Minoan script, is still undeciphered. We can read their accounting systems, but not their prayers. We see their faces in sculpture, but hear no voice. Their cities have been mapped, their trade patterns studied, but their language remains sealed. We know they were literate, organized, artistic, and, still, they left no explanation for their passing. Even their end is quiet. No grand tombs, no monuments to lost kings, no final message, just a layer of ash, a few scattered objects, and a palace crumbling into time. And yet, as we walk through Nasus today, under the Cretan sun, we find ourselves asking familiar questions. Who lived here? What did they believe? What did they fear or love? Did they know they were the first Europeans to build a civilization? Or were they simply managing a calendar, measuring barley, organizing trade? In the end, perhaps that is their legacy, not heroism or conquest, but order. They built, counted, recorded. They maintained the fragile systems of life. They built a palace not of conquest, but of logistics. And when it fell, the silence left behind was not empty but full of questions. So when you next hear the myth of the Minotaur, you might think, not of monsters, but of jars. Not of swords, but of stickles. Not of labyrinths of terror, but of corridors filled with light and the sound of soft sandals on stone. Because beneath the frescoes and above the storerooms, the palace of Nasus was never just a ruin or a riddle. It was a memory made in clay and, like all such memories, it waits patiently to be understood. The life and legend of Emperor Nero before there was fire, before the poisonings and conspiracies, before the name Nero became shorthand for cruelty and chaos, there was a boy. He was born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus on December 15, 37 CE, in Antium, a quiet coastal town south of Rome. His father, Aeneas Domitius Ahenobarbus, was a Roman noble with a reputation for arrogance and corruption. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was a descendant of the Julian Linus of Emperor Caligula, great-granddaughter of Augustus. She was ambitious, controlled, impossibly well-connected. From birth, Nero was not just a child, he was a pawn. In these early years, the Roman Empire was a machine of succession and suspicion. Emperors reigned less by legal authority than by balance between the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and the volatile court of whispers, letters, and political theater. Nero's path to power would be paved, not by popular demand, but by quiet calculation, mostly by his mother. When Nero was just 2 years old, his father died. Not a tragic accident, nor a heroic death in battle, just a quiet exit, convenient for those around him. Agrippina was left a widow in an empire where widows were not powerless, but politically dangerous. She was exiled not long afterward, accused of plotting against her brother, Emperor Caligula. It wasn't until the reign of Claudius, Caligula's uncle and successor, that her fortunes changed. Claudius, intelligent, bookish, and physically impaired from birth, was seen by many as a transitional ruler. Agrippina saw something else. Opportunity. In 49 CE, she married Claudius, her own uncle. It was scandalous by Roman standards, but politically effective. She convinced him to adopt Nero, then about 12 years old, and secure him as heir over Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. With that stroke of adoption, Lucius Domitius became Nero, Claudius Caesar, Drusus Germanicus, heir to the throne of the Roman Empire. Behind this name change was more than ambition, it was a rewriting of identity. Nero was dressed in the finest togas, trained in rhetoric, taught the histories of his supposed Julian ancestors. He studied with the philosopher Seneca, who would later serve as both tutor and advisor. This was no idle boy. He was crafted carefully to be palatable to the Senate, admirable to the public, and loyal to his mother. But what was Nero like? Contemporary sources mostly, later historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio paint a contradictory picture. He was charming but insincere, gifted in music, obsessed with performance, nervous, yet capable of bursts of theatrical cruelty. But these sources were written after his death, colored by disdain, politics, and rumor. The Nero they describe is not a person but a legend. The boy Nero, we suspect, was quieter. He was raised in rooms filled with echoes, plots, commands, rehearsed speeches. He practiced poetry and music. He watched executions and sat through legal hearings. He learned early that Rome was not a republic, it was an audience. To survive in Rome was to perform. To lead it was to outperform. By 54 CE, Nero was 16. Claudius, the emperor who had adopted him, died suddenly, likely poisoned. Many believed Agrippina was behind it. The dish, mushrooms. The symptom, paralysis. Claudius, whose health had always been fragile, slipped quietly away. Nero ascended to the throne with little resistance, and so began one of the most unusual reigns in Roman history. At first, it was a rule of proxies. Agrippina stood behind the throne, issuing decrees in his name. Seneca shaped his speeches. The Praetorian Guard commander Burrus managed security. For a while, this uneasy trio ruled. Effectively, Nero gave generous public games, spoke respectfully to the Senate, and promised a return to Augustan ideals. The early years were surprisingly stable. Reforms were passed, taxes adjusted, grain supplies stabilized. Nero, for all the later infamy, began not as a tyrant, but as a popular, almost passive emperor. But the facade couldn't last. Tensions rose first between Nero and his mother. Agrippina had expected to rule through her son, but Nero, now approaching adulthood, began to push back. He resented her control. He took lovers first, a freedwoman named Octa, later the aristocratic Poppaea Sabina. Agrippina disapproved of both. She reminded him who had made him emperor. He reminded her who wore the laurel. She moved out of the palace. He moved closer to independence. In 55 CE, Britannicus, son of Claudius, and a potential rival died during a dinner. The timing, once again, was suspicious. Some say Nero had him poisoned to eliminate a threat. Others believe Britannicus was already sick. The truth remains buried under centuries of assumption. But Nero's circle tightened. Soon after, Agrippina was removed from public life. First exiled, then, in 59 CE, executed. It was not a swift act of violence. Nero planned it carefully. One version of the story says he tried to drown her in a collapsible boat, an elaborate trap that failed when she swam ashore. Later, she was killed by assassins sent to her villa. When told she was to die, she supposedly offered her womb to be stabbed first, the same womb that had birthed an emperor. The sources are theatrical. So was the empire. By now, Nero had full control. Seneca and Burrus remained, but their influence waned. Nero indulged his passions: music, theater, chariot racing. He performed privately, then publicly. He built a golden house. He dressed in flamboyant robes. He wrote poetry, sang for dignitaries, played the lyre. This was not expected of a Roman emperor. To rule Rome was to stand above emotion, above vanity. Nero broke this mold. He blurred the line between public and private, between ruler and actor. His critics saw this as weakness, but the people, many loved him. He sponsored festivals. He reduced taxes. He walked among the man-emperor who did not retreat to marble chambers, but strutted on stage. But behind the applause, something darker was building. In the distance, whispers of discontent. In the Senate, murmurs of treason. In the provinces, generals watched, waited. Rome, ancient and fragile, had seen emperors fall before. It would again. And so, in 64 CE, when fire swept through the city, 9 days of smoke and ash, the people looked toward the golden palaces and asked, where was Nero? The answer would define him for centuries. But that is a story for another section. The fire began near the Circus Maximus, a densely packed area of shops, homes, and wooden structures. In the warm, dry summer air, the flames spread quickly, leaping from rooftop to rooftop, feeding on the chaos of narrow alleys and haphazard construction. The city, built more from necessity than planning, turned to tinder. Ancient sources report that the fire raged for 9 days. Whether this duration is exact or exaggerated, the destruction was vast. 10 of Rome's 14 districts were damaged. 3 were completely destroyed. Thousands were left homeless. Temples, tenements, granaries, all reduced to glowing rubble. And Nero, here the story bends. The most persistent version, the one echoed through centuries, claims that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. The image is vivid. The emperor on a rooftop, dressed in stage costume, singing of Troy as the flames consumed his own city. But this picture is not contemporary. It comes from later historians, most notably Tacitus, who admits in his Annals that the truth was unclear, even in his own time. Nero, Tacitus reports, was not in Rome when the fire started. He had been staying at his villa in Antium. When news reached him, he returned to the city. Far from indifference. Some sources say Nero opened his personal gardens to refugees. He funded emergency food distribution. He arranged temporary shelters. He even led recovery efforts, at least in the immediate aftermath. But perception is more enduring than fact. Rumors spread that Nero had started the fire himself, that he had wanted space to build a new palace, that the destruction was orchestrated, not accidental. Whether any of these accusations were true is still debated. The wooden parts of the city were always vulnerable to fire. Blazes were common, but this fire had become symbolic to large, too devastating to be explained by chance alone. Nero's popularity had already begun to erode among the upper classes. The Senate distrusted him. The aristocracy resented his public performances. His choice to appear on stage, unthinkable for a Roman emperor, was seen as unmanly. Now, with the city in ruins, those doubts hardened into fear. In response to the rumors, Nero found a scapegoat. He blamed the Christians. This early sect, small, obscure, and poorly understood, was already viewed with suspicion. They met in secret. They refused to sacrifice to Roman gods. They spoke of a kingdom not of this world. Nero seized on this difference. He accused the Christians of arson and treason. The punishment was theatrical. Tacitus describes horrifying scenes. Christians were sewn into the skins of animals and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. Some were dipped in pitch and burned alive as torches to light Nero's gardens at night. Whether these accounts are exact or exaggerated, they reflect the cruelty of the moment and the political calculus behind it. Nero was not acting out of spontaneous malice. He was performing control. Public executions served multiple purposes. In Rome, punishment, deterrent, and entertainment. But under Nero, the line between justice and spectacle blurred further. The man who sang on stage now staged death. Theatricality had become policy. And then came the Domus. In the burned-out center of Rome, Nero ordered construction of a vast palace, the Golden House. Unlike earlier imperial residences, which were grand but relatively private, the Domus Aurea sprawled across the city's heart. It included artificial lakes, manicured gardens, frescoed halls, and a rotating banquet room. Its walls shimmered with gold leaf and precious stones. It was less a house than a landscape, a palace as theatrical stage. The timing was disastrous. With Rome still smoldering, the construction of such opulence sent a message, whether intended or not, that the emperor saw the destruction not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. For his enemies, this was proof. Nero, they said, had burned Rome to build his palace. Whether or not this was true hardly mattered. The perception took hold. The myth, once told, could not be untold. Meanwhile, Nero's interest in performance deepened. He toured Greece in 66–67 CE, participating in festivals and contests. He sang, he played the lyre, he acted in tragedies. He even competed in Olympic Games, despite the fact that emperors traditionally remained above such events. Greek audiences, out of courtesy or fear, awarded him victories. Nero returned to Rome with hundreds of crowns and medals, but this tour was more than vanity. It was also policy. Nero forgave Greek cities their taxes. He praised their culture. He sought to transform the empire not by conquest, but by aesthetics. He wanted to be remembered not as a warrior, but as an artist emperor. For him, the power of Rome was not in swords or stone, but in sound, image, and myth. He believed that beauty could rule, but Rome did not believe the same. The Senate, already uneasy, grew alarmed by his neglect of governance. Grain prices fluctuated. Conspiracies blossomed, first whispered, then attempted. In 65 CE, the Pisonian conspiracy, a plot to assassinate Nero and install Senator Gaius Calpurnius Piso, was discovered and crushed. Dozens were executed or forced to commit suicide, including Nero's former tutor, Seneca. Seneca's death was emblematic of this period. Philosophical stoicism, colliding with imperial paranoia. The man who had once shaped Nero's words now died by his order. Seneca opened his veins calmly, as befit a Roman philosopher. But the blood did not flow easily. It was slow, painful. He reportedly dictated final thoughts to his scribes, dying not quickly but with dramatic composure. Even death, under Nero, was a performance. Back in Rome, dissatisfaction grew. Taxation increased to fund Nero's projects. His behavior became erratic. He executed rivals without trial. He forced senators to applaud his performances. He neglected Italy's military campaigns and provincial concerns. For all his early promise, Nero had alienated nearly every power block in Rome: the Senate, the aristocracy, and eventually, the army. And so, rebellion spread quietly at first, then openly. By 68 CE, governors in Gaul and Hispania revolted. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal, turned against him. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Nero fled the city, seeking refuge. He was only 30 years old, surrounded by a few loyal freedmen. He took shelter in a villa outside Rome. As soldiers approached, he prepared for suicide. Unable to do it himself, he asked his servant to help. His final words, as recorded by were qualis artifex perio, what an artist dies in me. Whether these words were ever spoken is debatable, but they summarize Nero's self-image, not as a villain, but as a misunderstood genius, not a tyrant, but a performer in a world unwilling to watch. His body was buried quietly. His name was officially erased from monuments, but the stories lingered, and so we must ask, was Nero truly mad or simply too theatrical for the empire he tried to reshape? Nero's death in June 68 CE marked more than the end of a life. It marked the beginning of an identity crisis for the Roman Empire. With no heir, no clear line of succession, and no one quite like him, Rome didn't just lose an emperor, lost a shape, a mirror, and perhaps an illusion. For all the chaos attributed to his reign, Nero had kept the empire together. His death, followed by the declaration of damnatio memorio, the official erasure of his name from public inscriptions, was meant to be closure. But Nero would not stay buried. His reign had left scars too intricate to fade. The months after his death spiraled into what historians now call the Year of the Four Emperors. In a single year, 4 men claimed the imperial title: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally, Vespasian. The empire, exhausted and leaderless, swung from one hand to another. Soldiers mutinied, governors rebelled, cities suffered, the empire trembled, and with each tremor, the memory of Nero loomed larger. Ironically, the more Rome tried to forget him, the more it clung to him. In the eastern provinces, particularly in Greece and Asia Minor, rumors arose. Nero, they said, had not died at all. He had faked his suicide. He had fled to Parthia. He was gathering an army. He would return. This was not just hopeful fantasy, it was belief. Within a few years of his death, several impostors appeared. These so-called pseudo-Neros attracted real followings. One of them, described in ancient accounts, bore a striking resemblance to the emperor, played the lyre, and sang publicly just as the real Nero had done. He gathered support among Parthian sympathizers before being captured and executed. But the fact that these impostors existed at all is telling. Nero flamboyant, flawed, theatrical, Nero had become a symbol. To the Roman elite, he remained a cautionary tale, a warning against indulgence, against artistic vanity, against unchecked power. But to the common people, especially in the East, he became something else entirely. A lost king, a misunderstood artist, a cultural hero. It is in this duality that Nero's legacy becomes so slippery. Contemporary Roman historians Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius, Dio wrote, long after Nero's death, their accounts are detailed but biased, flavored by political agendas and retrospective outrage. They portray Nero as impulsive, paranoid, cruel, guilty of matricide, arson, and degeneracy. But these accounts, though damning, are not without contradiction. Nero, they admit, lowered taxes. He banned capital punishment for a time. He expanded the empire's reach into Armenia. He hosted games, funded grain distribution, and implemented urban reforms after the Great Fire. He also undertook perhaps the most ambitious rebuilding program in Roman history. The fire gave him the excuse, but the vision was his. The streets of Rome, chaotic and tangled before, were reorganized with fire breaks and better access. He improved water infrastructure and reimagined public space, not just for the elite, but for the masses. His crime, in the eyes of many Roman elites, was not failure, it was eccentricity. He broke norms. He performed poetry on stage. He raced chariots in public. He treated Greeks, traditionally seen as soft by Roman militarists, as cultural equals. His vision of the empire was not strictly martial or administrative. It was artistic. This, more than his alleged murders, may have been what made him unacceptable. But history, especially Roman history, is not written in fairness. It is written by survivors, and Nero had none. By the time the Flavian dynasty took root under Vespasian, Nero's reputation had calcified into myth. His palace, the Domus Aurea, was buried literally. Vespasian filled it in, built the Colosseum on top of it, and presented himself as the anti-Nero, a soldier, a builder, a stabilizer. But the legend lived on. In Christian tradition, Nero took on an even darker aura. Because he had persecuted early Christians brutally, if not consistently, he became a symbol of evil. Some early Christian writers equated him with the Antichrist. The idea that Nero would return, not just as a rebel emperor, but as a harbinger of apocalypse, crept into religious texts and apocalyptic visions. In the Book of Revelation, written decades after Nero's death, some scholars believe the beast, whose number is 666, was code for Nero Caesar. The letters of his name in Hebrew numerology add to 666, whether intended or not. The association stuck. Nero became a cultural ghost. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, he was revived, reinterpreted, and dramatized. He appears in Dante's Inferno, condemned in the circles of hell, in Baroque operas and Victorian dramas. He is the archetype of the mad tyrant, the emperor who killed his mother, set fire to his own capital, and sang while the city screamed. But beneath this theatrical horror, another image persisted, a gifted, insecure, isolated ruler who mistook art for absolution. In recent decades, modern historians have begun to reassess Nero slowly, carefully, without romanticism. Archaeology has confirmed many aspects of his reign that suggest effective governance, particularly in the early years. The Domus Aurea, once vilified, is now recognized as a masterpiece of architectural innovation. Vaulted ceilings, rotating banquet rooms, walls designed to reflect candlelight. Nero may not have been a good ruler by Roman standards, but he was undeniably imaginative. He ruled at the intersection of politics and performance, in a time when deviation from the Roman ideal was more dangerous than cruelty itself. He did not lose power because he was a monster. He lost power because he failed to act like the kind of monster Rome preferred. And so we are left with a paradox. Nero, who sought immortality through art, achieved it through infamy. His name survives, not because of what he created, but because of what he was said to have destroyed. Yet when you walk through the corridors of the Domus Aurea, today partially excavated beneath the modern city, you find something unexpected. Not madness, but geometry. Not horror, but elegance. Gold still flickers faintly in the corners. The dome still curves with impossible precision. The illusion is gone, but the artistry remains. It is a reminder that history is not made only in marble or fire, but also in performance. And Nero, he was many things, but above all, he was a performer. In a city that expected a ruler,